Hi. So the claim that I am refuting is that indirect potable reuse is significantly more effective than ocean desalinization. The advocates' secondary points start out by saying indirect potable reuse is considerably cheaper than desalinization. Secondly, they state that indirect potable reuse has a substantially larger capacity for growth. And lastly, they say that indirect potable reuse has a noticeably lower environmental impact than desalinization. And I would like to say that there is insufficient amount of evidence to support such a conclusion, and that desalinization is not only as effective, but possibly more effective than indirect potable reuse. So first of all, from my findings have indicated that desalinization can actually be cheaper than indirect potable reuse. The advocate used the examples of the groundwater replenishment system, or GWRS, and the Carlsbad desalinization plant. And he started off by saying that the groundwater, the GWRS only took $480 million to construct, while the Carlsbad desalinization plant took $1 billion. And there's two problems with that. From what I could find, the Carlsbad desalinization plant isn't actually fully operational yet. Two, it's the $1 billion is for the whole project with all the pipelines, where the actual plant, the projected cost of that would be around $350 million. So it's actually a deal cheaper than the groundwater replenishment system. And secondly, he says that the indirect potable reuse, it produces water at a cheaper unit cost, but that's really vague, because in the early stages of the desalinization plant, there are a lot of other costs that are factoring into the unit costs. And because it's privately owned, it's pretty hard to get an actual figure on the cost, but I was able to find a study that indicated that desalinization can range anywhere from $600 per acre foot all the way to $2,500 per acre foot, which is a big range, and it can actually be cheaper than the $850 that groundwater replenishment costs. So for his second point, he says there's a substantially larger capacity for production and growth. Now, this the way he reaches this conclusion is by directly comparing these two plants, and that's not a very fair way to approach this, because these two plants aren't at the full capacity of they can be expanded far past what they're currently at. There is the Ras Al Khair desalinization plant in Saudi Arabia. It's the largest desalinization plant in the world, and it produces 273 million gallons of drinking water per day, which is a bit more than the 100 million gallons produced by the groundwater replenishment system. And lastly, he's saying that the indirect potable reuse is much better for the environment, because they take a portion, 35%, and pump it in to create an inclusion barrier, and then pump the rest into the groundwater. And then and it also states that it uses less energy. But first of all, you can pump any water, whether it be desalinization or boat reuse, to create an inclusion barrier, which stops seawater from creeping into the groundwater supply. So there's no real value to desalinization, and the fact that it uses less energy is kind of confusing, because when you use indirect potable reuse, after you treat it, you actually pump it back into the groundwater, where it has to be pumped back out and retreated. So it doesn't take into account that amount of energy. And that, for those reasons, I think that desalinization is the better option to go with.
Such an outline. Thank you. All right, structurally, everything's good at the beginning of the speech. I think you make a good argument about whether or not this comparison is the best sort of thing to be talking about. On the cost issue, I thought you had a nice explanation on the differences between the two things that were being compared. I didn't hear any citation of evidence on this particular point. I know you got the information from someplace, but it ought to be cited in the argument. So that's, I think, a little bit of a problem. Then there's a kind of an argument about some of the information being a bit vague, and I understand that particular point. I like the fact that you did have some information that suggests that there's a range in costs for the desalinated water. Again, I think a source site would have been useful on this, and the comparison is to what the reclamation cost would be. So we've got anywhere from $600 to $2,500 per acre foot versus $850 per acre foot. So some are definitely below, some are above. Then the question becomes, which is likely to be the system that we're operating under. And I don't think that you really develop an argument on that point, but you do show why it might be a little bit too premature to reach the conclusion that the advocate is talking about. The capacity issue, I thought, got a little bit confusing. There's an argument about expansion, and I think that you need to show that either facility could be expanded or they can't be expanded. It sounds to me like the inference here would be that the desalinization process could be expanded to include more. The comparison that you make is to the Saudi Arabia plant, which is producing not quite, but almost 3 times as much water a day as the groundwater reclamation plant. But again, we don't know what the comparable sizes of the plants are. I think that one of your arguments on these points ought to be that the advocates basically making a comparison between things that are dissimilar, and until we have some consistent way of measuring either the cost of the water per unit or the cost of the production facilities, that we're in a little bit of problem. I think you have an interesting challenge on the argument about the desalinization plant, that it included additional costs that are being added to it, like piping and that sort of thing. That's all assertion. Again, that's up on that first point, and that's another reason why you need to have the evidence on that particular point. The environmental issue, I'm not exactly sure. There's a demonstration of what the value is in these inclusion process. Why one is more significant than the other, I frankly, It all sounded very abstract to me, and I'm not sure what it ends up meaning. So as a casual listener, I'm a little unclear as to what assessment I'm supposed to be making here at the end. So I thought that was a little problematic. That's probably true for both speakers, by the way.